Welcome, everybody, and welcome back. If you were here last week for the first in our 4 events related to the dawn of everything. My name's Stephen Young. I'm an Associate Professor of Geography and International Studies here on campus. I am also the Faculty Director of IRIS NRC, and we're one of the federally funded centers on campus with a mission to offer programming and expertise to K-12 and community college educators, as well as students in the community at large, that will hopefully inspire informed thinking about complex and cross-regional issues in our world today. And you can find more information about our events and resources if you go to our webpage, irisnrc.com, and you'll see presentations and conversations with artists and activists and academics and so on. Today's event is being co-sponsored by the Havens Center, the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, the Center for Southeast Asia, and the Department of Anthropology at UW-Madison. So thank you to our co-sponsors. Claire Lamoureux, our PA at the center, will be running the tech support. Hello, Claire. If you have any challenges, you can use the chat function to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the recording via email with people who registered but can't attend at this time, but you'll only show on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. Before we move to the main event, I want to acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dechope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. And this history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations in Wisconsin. So today's event, last week, I won't be repeating the intro I gave last week, but I talked a little bit about the authors and about how I sort of came to the book and became interested in reading it and talking about it. I will say that last summer I was in England after I'd read the book, and if you in the tube station there were posters about the book, in prominent places, and there was even an event at University College London where David Wengrow talks, where people like Paul Gilroy, the great British sociologist of sort of Black experience in Britain, were commenting on the book, as well as other archaeologists and historians. But when I came back in the summer to the US, I tried to tentatively initiate a conversation with some of my colleagues about, oh, have you read this book? What do you think? And everybody was like, oh, really? No, I've not read it. But I mean, who really goes around writing books called A New History of Humanity? It's not a very fashionable thing to do right now. Or, people felt as well, wow, there's these 2 white academics that are coming in here with their meta-narrative, we've been there before. So I kind of felt a little deflated. And then one day I was at, just one of these bureaucratic meetings on campus that we all have to go to. And there was Nam Kim from the anthropology department, who I knew had experience in terms of archaeology. And I very cautiously said, Nam, do you know anything about this book? And his response was really what gave me a little bit more confidence that we could make this happen. So I'm delighted that one of our 2 speakers today is indeed Nam Kim, who is an associate professor here on campus. He's an anthropological archaeologist interested in socio-political complexity, early forms of cities, factors associated with significant cultural change, and the relationship between modern politics, cultural heritage, and the material record. And he's especially interested in the cultural context and social consequences of organized violence and warfare, as manifested in various cultural, spatial, and temporal settings, and has done a lot of research in East and Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. Our other speaker today is Cecil Schroeder, who is a professor of anthropology here as well. I was just saying before we got started, Cecil is on research leave this semester, but was still willing to accept our invitation and take the time to join us and share some thoughts. She has four interrelated spheres of study: ecological and agency-based considerations for emerging socio-political complexity among ancient societies in mid-continental and southeastern United States. Secondly, historical ecological efforts at modeling ancient resource productivity and constructing ancient anthropogenic landscapes. Third, microhistorical investigation of households, ancient architecture, planned communities, and built landscapes as expressions of social order, in which both cosmological canons of design and vernacular traditions of engineering and construction contribute to architectural variation. And fourth, the history of archaeology as practiced in the United States in the first half of the 20th century, a time when newly discovered archaeological evidence was used to establish cultural, historical meta-narratives that are still in use in many regions today. So with that said, I mean, again, it's kind of like the joy of working in a university is if you've read a book like myself and you get all lost and confused and there's lots of references to stuff that you think, that sounds interesting, but I don't really understand whether this is what's original or what's controversial, what's convincing. You find the people who can help provide some of that expertise and context. And I can't think of two better people to help steer us through a conversation about the book today, particularly thinking about these chapters from 3 to 7. So, Nam, you're going to kick us off with a few thoughts and ideas for conversation. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And I just want to say thank you for the very generous introduction. And I'd like to thank NRC for organizing this event or this series of events. When we first talked about this idea, I had not had a chance to really read the book, but I've had now time to digest and think about some of the arguments being made by the authors. And I quite agree that this is a very important piece of research. With as ambitious of a scope as they've laid out, there's inevitably going to be areas of contention and debate, which is to be expected. But there are a few areas that I think are very important to think about and can generate a lot of healthy debate and ongoing discussion. And here I'm thinking about some of the explicit arguments that they make regarding the so-called revolutions. So if we think about revolutions that did or did not happen and how they may be sort of portrayed within the general public's mindset about the human past and the origins of so-called civilizations and states and the underpinnings of those developments. This is where our kinds of analogies with studies of the present come into play. This is where the archaeological record comes into play. So I'd like to talk about a couple of those revolutions, at least bring them up, and I'm happy to discuss them further and hear thoughts from everybody else as well. And obviously the first revolution, if we go chronologically, is one that people have been talking about for decades, and that is what we refer to as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. And this is firmly within the so-called ice ages. This is roughly 40,000 years ago or so. And according to the central tenets, and I'm going to put this in a kind of a nutshell of the argument, the Upper Paleolithic Revolution argues that at around that time period, particularly in a geographic space in parts of Europe, that we see major changes happening in human cognition and behavior. And a lot of this is based on what we see in terms of rock art and representation in some caves like Lascaux, Chauvet, and others in parts of France and elsewhere in Europe. And based on these finds, in combination with some of the fossil record and material record that would be complementary, folks started to conclude that potentially this is the beginnings of modern behavior, symbolic thinking, what we might consider behavior, anatomically behavior, or I should say modern behavior and cognition that may or may not correspond to anatomically modern human physiology. And this revolution, we can point out, has since been challenged and in many ways dismantled because of archaeological finds elsewhere in the world. We know that around the same time period, we can see evidence of very sophisticated forms of rock art also being depicted elsewhere in the globe. at the same time. So I'm here now referencing evidence from areas of Southeast Asia, specifically parts of Africa. We also know that there are examples of very sophisticated art and representation, symbolic thinking, that's in the material record of parts of Africa that go back even further in time. So because of that, that so-called revolution has sort of been dismantled. And this is something that the authors go into detail in one of the chapters, I think in chapter 3 specifically, when they talk about the variability and variation of human behavior in the past, not just in terms of what we can see reflected by the material record, but also in terms of the physiology. So they go into detail about Pleistocene human and other kinds of populations that are related to the human lineage. So that's one area that we can talk about. Another area that I think is important to think about is the so-called agricultural or Neolithic revolution. So this is now much more recent in time, and we are firmly within areas of the mid-Holocene, something like 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And in this traditional perspective, this is also an argument that has been proposed and debated going back a few decades, where one of the central tenets of this argument is that the rise of quote unquote civilizations, ancient states, forms of cities and urbanism, that all of that was preceded by a very important set of conditions set up by the so-called agricultural revolution. In a nutshell, without the changes that we see in terms of domesticated plants and animals, leading to sedentism, higher rates of investment in parcels of land and larger populations, without all of that happening, we would not see, coming on the heels of all that, these massive changes associated with the emergence of what many people refer to as the first states, the primary or pristine cases of civilization. So this is the argument, right? This is the revolution that supposedly happens in the mid-Holocene. And what our authors talk about is that's a very simplistic kind of perspective that maybe decades ago was tenable, but the more and more archaeological data that we uncover and interpret, the more cases that we see, the more we might challenge that kind of conventional history. And we can get into some of those cases and what they mean by the variability of the evidence and the finer points regarding all of that, because related to that would be ideas about egalitarianism, social inequality, whether or not those are specific or restricted to certain time periods only, and that do they fit into this larger narrative, the conventional wisdom of changes that are happening across human history in this kind of neat sequence that the authors are questioning. And that takes us to this other revolution. Well, maybe this is more of an assumption, and that's related to these revolutions. And that assumption is something that they challenge as well in this kind of thinking of trajectories, linear trajectories. So this is something that if we look at the history of anthropology in the Western world and the beginnings of ethnographic research and how some of these kinds of disciplinary projects were really tied up with colonial projects, where we see some of the earliest ethnographic accounts are some of the places that Western powers, European countries, were going into indigenous areas and colonizing areas. So in some ways, the beginnings of anthropology are tied to this history. But what's interesting about this is those kinds of political backgrounds, those backdrops, did have an impact on some of the early thinking. And there was armchair anthropology that was happening at the time that was sort of not reliant on archaeological data in the beginning, but more speculative. And a lot of that speculation was tied to this idea that all societies undergo a kind of set of transformations that are linear and unilinear, that we all go through the same kinds of changes. There's the very famous scheme of savages, barbarians, civilizations, and other kinds of schemes that were promoted in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And these sorts of of arguments were offered as conjecture by anthropologists, but then others, including politicians, colonial administrators, would take those ideas and run with them, and in some cases use them as justification for some of the imperial kind of colonial projects that we witnessed in those eras. So there are very interesting parallels between our thinking about these questions, the history of political thought, the history of the world, and how they have sort of developed and evolved to the point that we are in now, where we can incorporate more and more material evidence to test some of these hypotheses, to revisit some of these questions. And the authors do so in very interesting ways. I would say that not all of the archaeological world would agree with many of their interpretations and their sweeping kinds of arguments and generalizations, but at the same time, I personally find it productive to ponder and to assess, because they put some of these arguments on the table in very stark and contrasting ways, and open debate and invite conversation. So I'll just leave it at that, and I'm happy to revisit some of these points later on.
Thank you so much for getting us started thinking about this. Sissel, welcome, and we'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Well, Nam has done just such a lovely job summarizing many of the key points of the chapters that we read for this week, as well as contextualizing them in the kind of broader political landscape in the world over the past 400 years, 500 years, and in the discipline. And I think what I would add is that, I mean, we all know that David Graeber was an anarchist, and this book really very much presents an anarchist's view of the history of humankind, particularly over the past probably 40,000 years. But what was really striking to me from this anarchist perspective was the rejection of orthodoxy in the discipline of anthropology, archaeology. And certainly some of the issues that they critique, like the linear evolution, the model of linear evolution that emerged in the 1700s, 1800s, that stuff has been critiqued by anthropologists and archaeologists for more than 30 years, but never in contexts that are, I would say, that accessible to non-specialists, as is the case with this book. One of the really important contributions that I see out of this book that I think is, I don't know that all archaeologists or anthropologists would agree with this, but they are roundly challenging the ethnographic perspective on foraging societies. Those perspectives are drawn from early explorations of Europeans into parts of the world that they'd never visited before. And there are certain tropes and approaches to describing the other that characterize some of those early accounts, which we wouldn't necessarily call ethnographic, they're more ethnohistoric. But once we get trained anthropologists really settling in to communities and studying foraging societies, by that point, foraging societies are living in marginalized environments. They're politically, socially marginalized, or environmentally marginalized. And consequently, in my opinion, what we know ethnographically about foraging societies likely represents an extremely small sliver of the variation that once existed in those societies. And this has been a particularly important thing for me in my work, because I work in Eastern North America. I work in a landscape that is resource rich and that was not fully occupied. There were plenty of resource-rich areas for populations to go if they wanted to move out of a location that they were in. And consequently, the ethnographic record doesn't help me. It's really only archaeology, the archaeological evidence, that can inform us about this variation in the early foraging societies. and in as well their persistence through time. And so I see it as a call for more archaeology. Archaeology is the best source of information for 99% of human past. So that's I'll leave it there. There's so much interesting stuff to talk about in details, in bigger picture things. So I guess I'll turn it back to Stephen.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for comments and questions to everybody. I believe that you should be able to unmute yourself. And maybe what we'll do is collect a few comments, thoughts, questions, reflections from people, and then maybe I'll ask Norman Sissel if you invite you to respond as you want based on anything that comes up in that conversation. But who'd like to get us started?
So can I just follow up, Cecil, on your last comment about a call for more archaeology? I know there are archaeologists in the room, and so I think we grappled with this in our last discussion. Why do we even need the meta narrative that we're being offered about colonial justifications for projects in other places in the world at all as part of this work? If really in the end it's coming down to more archaeology.
I think it's, if we're inherently interested in the past and understanding something about the past, and not all human societies are, but Western society is, archaeology is going to be our the primary source of evidence, and the archaeological record is biased in certain ways, just as the ethnographic and ethnohistoric records are. But in colonial settings, so much disruption to the cultures that were living in those places that were colonized, wide scale death from disease, warfare, and just outright efforts to eliminate native populations in many parts of the world have left those societies, many of those societies, somewhat bereft about their own pasts in some ways. And so some indigenous peoples want to draw on the archaeological record to learn more about their own past. And we're seeing that with an increasing number of indigenous scholars from the United States, from Canada, who are entering the discipline and field of archaeology and bringing some really different perspectives to the evidence that we typically work with. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Absolutely, that it's just that part of the colonial past is dealing with the justifications for those projects and how they affected or even in some cases eradicated what came before.
Mm-hmm. And this is particularly evident in around the world, the widespread focus of archaeologists on burial grounds. And in Eastern North America, many of those are found in earthen mounds, but they are also cemeteries that don't have such visible markings. And that's a particularly, that represents such a small percentage of people's lives, how they live their lives on a daily basis. It's just been overemphasized in archaeological research until really the past 30 years, where archaeologists have questioned their reliance on that kind of evidence to the exclusion of examining households, examining areas of the absence of archaeological evidence, and trying to understand why archaeological evidence is absent in some places.
I know that J. David Stanfield has their hand up, and I just wanted to piggyback off of the question and last comment. when we think about the discipline of archaeology, there's a concerted push in recent years to sort of what we call decolonize the practice. And that is to bring more and more stakeholders to the table when we consider forms of community projects, the kinds of questions that are being asked, how the research is being designed, and who gets to participate and become stewards of that cultural heritage. Archaeology is not the same, depending on where you are in the world. It can exist for different reasons, and the practices can vary. I mean, I can say in my own work in Vietnam, archaeology is very much a part of history, and it is also a part of national reconstructions of history as well. So it becomes a very complex, messy process. But ultimately, it is a form of the present day intersecting with the past and interpreting that past and forming identities for the present day as well. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. Then I see that David has their hand up.
Hi, I'd like to have you comment, the panel or Stephen, on the discussion of private property in this set of chapters, and the way that the authors critique the sequencing of the emergence of private property as leading to differentiation of societies and hierarchies. That's the standard argument that they critique, and their critique is that private property has got its roots in the notions of the sacred, which extends much further back than just what the typical place of private property concepts normally give to it. And I just wondered what you thought of the way that they've conceived of the concept of private property.
Do we have any other questions or comments right now? Otherwise, we can engage with that question. But if anyone wants to post anything in the chat or add another comment. Or if Nam or Cecil, did you want to respond to this idea of private property and how they're trying to critique the ways we normally think about its sort of emergence in different places, and the sort of its positioning temporally in this particular kind of linear story, and how they're trying to trouble that?
Cecil, do you want to start? I can start.
I guess the thing that I would say is that there's a lot of variation in how people think about private property in societies around the world today. It's not just a kind of Eurocentric or Western or American idea of what constitutes private property. And one of the things I found, kind of insightful about their discussion is the concept of knowledge, and particularly ritual knowledge, as a form of private property, and ritual objects as a form of private property that can only be passed on or transmitted to someone else if the keeper, owner of that information or those objects is willing to transmit it. So that's an aspect of private property that I think we never really consider in our society. Nam?
Yeah, I'm particularly intrigued too by the argument that they're making. The notion of the sacred I found very striking, because as Cecil just commented, we can consider, the more we look at the archaeological record, the more we realize just how much variation there is in perceptions and cultural preferences when it comes to what might be part of our, for lack of a better term, our belongings, right? So it could be as simple as materials. It could be natural resources. It could be a piece of land. But at the same time, when we start to throw in notions of ideology and the sacred, there are rituals, there are rites, there can be forms of knowledge that are equally tied to these various domains. And here I'm thinking about, for example, if we think about ancient China and the Central Plains, from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age. So we're talking about maybe 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, we start to see large scale proto-cities beginning to emerge in this area. And certainly by the time of the Bronze Age, with some of the early dynasties of Chinese history, we can see major changes happening. But one of the things that we can make out is there's a thread of continuity in terms of ritual practice. And I'm talking specifically about forms of divination, where folks would take different materials like the scapula of cattle, place them into fire, treat them under fire to see patterns of cracking within the bones. And based on those patterns, make interpretations about what the ancestors or what the gods are trying to communicate to the living. And based on that kind of divination, that gives you ideas about how to live your life, decisions that might be made when it's time to harvest, who you trade with, who you might go to war with, and so forth. This was a practice that was open to everyone. Everyone knew about it. Everyone more or less had access to the materials and to the rituals. What is interesting is by the time we get to the first historically documented dynasty, the Shang dynasty of ancient China in the Bronze Age, what we see happening is that the state, as it emerges, appropriates this practice in its highest form. And the claim that is made is everyone has access to these sorts of practices, but we perform it at the highest level. And therefore, our communication with the ancestors or with the supernatural realm, those are on top of everything else. So what we say is at the apex. And so political authority gets tied into this. So these sorts of, in a sense, it's not just about private property in terms of our kind of modern conception of what property might look like. But all of a sudden now, property can be people, it can be rituals, it can be sacred landscapes, all sorts of things where ideas can get tied in as much as it's material or other kinds of resources, tangible as well as the intangible, all get tied into this sense of property. And so the question that our J. David, I think you raised, the argument that the authors talk about the sacred, I think it's a very intriguing one that can lead us to very different directions and to explore the material record in a variety of ways.
I just kind of build on that with some examples from native North America, where there are objects of cultural patrimony that are considered to belong to the community as a whole. No single individual can make a decision about them. And then there are other objects of cultural significance that are connected with a specific individual. And it's that connection that makes it so important. So, there's some really other interesting ways to think of this.
Thank you so much. Before I've got questions, but I would love to have anybody else be able to ask a question before I do.
Hi, so I will ask a question. What you were just talking about makes me go back to what Cecil said earlier, that not all cultures are interested in history. I think I got you correct, Cecil. And when you said that, I was thinking that perhaps not all societies are interested in history as we understand it here in the West. I, of course, don't claim to know all societies or merely anything close to that. But for my work through the years with various indigenous people, it's true that I don't think I ever heard them talking about in the year 1000, we live like this or that. But what I do hear them talking about is we got that from our ancestors. We got their ceremonies, we got their teachings. We learned that from those who came before us. And I wonder if that's not a version of history, if you know, we're not, by saying things like that, if we're not limiting ourselves to a very Western understanding of what history is. Like Nam said, they received ritual stuff, they received ceremonies, they received wisdom. And maybe that's more important than knowing if people lived in cities or in villages, if they were foragers or agriculturalists. It still is history, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That kind of the oral traditions are a form of history. Genealogical histories are important to many people. I was thinking of groups like, I think it's the Inuit, who think about time in a circular manner. And so there is no linear past for them. It's only kind of a recapitulation of the past moving into the future. And that's a very different way of thinking about history that isn't shared cross-culturally by everybody around the world. And I'm also thinking about, you know, for many contemporary Indigenous peoples, their history is very traumatizing. And so they certainly do have, and that's the recent history. So the way they may think about the past is going to be more emotional than detached than the way we might think about the past. And because of those traumas, you know, there's a lot of interest in and effort on moving things forward in a different direction and really making substantive and lasting changes in their societies to, you know, demarginalize them and, you know, respect the nature of their cultural traditions and cultural practices.
You know, if I can add to that, and this is sort of in answer to the comment, I think there are different kinds of histories and different kinds of perspectives, and a lot of that has to do with our positionality. Right. Some of us have the privilege and the luxury to ask certain kinds of questions, to interrogate historical records, and to ponder some of these big questions, the way that our authors are pondering, right? This is the dawn of everything. But there are other kinds of functions and other kinds of histories and what they mean for people, and depending on one's approach and one's objectives, the kinds of questions you might ask might be very, very different. So as Sissel was just pointing out, some histories, including recent histories for different communities, might be extremely fraught and problematic and full of trauma. You know, so in my own work, I'm thinking about Vietnamese history. Now, Vietnam itself has changed dramatically in the last century, in the last several centuries. And if we go back to 2,000 years ago, and then all bets are off, right? But the Vietnamese, depending on who you talk to, will cite certain forms of the narrative, certain mythologies and legends that are part of the fabric of Viet identity, and say that this is our shared common cultural heritage. And they've sought to find the material evidence that corroborates all of those sorts of narratives. The reality, though, is how Vietnam might have looked 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago is radically different than what anybody might say today. The other reality is that history, whatever might be reconstructed, doesn't necessarily represent everybody in the country of Vietnam. We can point to something like 50 different ethnic groups within the country. So to say that there is a monolithic kind of origin story for Viet society today is erroneous. From that standpoint, I think it becomes important to sort of identify positionality when we talk about history, but then to acknowledge that the archaeological record is in many ways largely devoid of that kind of promise. We cannot say very much about specific languages that might have been spoken 2,000 years ago in a given area. We can't say very much about how the people living there would have viewed themselves in terms of specific identity. The things that we can say, however, would be some of the kinds of practices that existed. We can reconstruct those behaviors. We can also make attempts to incorporate different forms of history. And I think, Esti, this might be getting at some of the comments that you were making. I'm very interested in how various forms of oral traditions can also be valid sources of information and data. There had been a tendency, and there continues to be in some circles, to privilege certain kinds of information over others, and to sort of downplay or trivialize other forms of information, such as legends or folk tales or oral traditions. But the reality is, a lot of very important information does get transmitted accurately across even thousands of years in terms of oral traditions. And we can see this playing out in different parts of the world. And increasingly, researchers are seeing that as a legitimate source of information and actually finding ways to test those hypotheses through the material record, which I find fascinating.
Nam, I would just sort of build on the importance of thinking about positionality as well. In terms of the question that you raised, Etsy, the idea that outsiders might tell the history, it may be offensive in some societies, and so they are not going to share the information. They're not going to answer the questions that we might ask because it's not our place to explore their history and they'll let us know that very, very clearly and carefully.
Yeah, if I may follow up, and it's not a fully thought out thought here, but again, Cecil, you were talking about societies that have been traumatized and if I understand you correctly, therefore don't want to engage or don't engage in their history. I'm first generation after the Holocaust. I come from Israel. There's nothing really but the trauma that the way I understand Israel and its colonialist tendencies and its aggression is this is a response to the Holocaust and what came before that. But, this is the child of an abusive parent becoming an abusive parent kind of thing. So again, I just, what I'm trying to say is that there's no one way that people or peoples respond to situations such as trauma. I'm just trying to go back also to the circularity and I don't know. I don't have really a foreign thing to say. I feel that circularity is that there's a lot of truth to that, but that's all I can say at this moment.
Well, I think you've touched on something really important here, and that is that not only is there a lot of variation among societies across the world and through time. But even within any society, there's a lot of variation. And this is another little nitpicky thing I have with ethnography is that it oftentimes is based on a single interlocutor, a single person that the ethnographer got most of their information from. And so it may not be a very representative portrayal of a particular society. And I think in archaeology and anthropology, we tend to lose sight of that internal variation because we get, and they talk about this, how archaeologists, particularly like V. Gordon Childe, began to define culture areas based on the co-occurrence of similar forms of material culture in similar contexts. And in many respects, that's it's an imposition of a classification onto the past just based on an incomplete record. And whether those people saw themselves as that socially and culturally unified as the archaeological culture concept would convey is, it's almost certainly wrong. And so I really want to just call out your highlighting of variation as such an important contribution that this book makes, as even though at times it glosses over all that variation.
Thank you both, and thank you, Stephen, and everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't know how to raise my hand on that.
That's great. All right, Elaine, go right ahead.
I really want to thank both of you as well, because I wasn't going to read any more of this book because I found it too frustrating in that all they were doing was tearing things down, and it was, well, this might have been a good idea, but no, it isn't really. And I kept thinking of alternative answers to some of the questions that they were asking, especially this concept of time, because when you talk about even agrarian societies, the idea of a future means that you're going to save something today for tomorrow. And but I guess the question and so thank you for explaining a lot to me, because I really don't understand the anthropology, and I might go back and read more of the book with this understanding. But the other question that I had in all of this is, after they've torn down so many things, what is the commonality? It's not language. It's not physical structures. Is it just us, our humanity? I mean, are we going to find out what that is that we're searching for the cause of? I mean, maybe this is too fundamental a question about, cross-cultural anthropology or archaeology. How can we learn anything from the quote unquote evidence unless we're learning more about ourselves? So I don't know if it's a general question and a thank you mostly.
Well, I guess I'll start. Thank you, Elaine, for that comment and that question. I understand the tendency to be frustrated as one reads, because there's a fair amount of subjective interpretation and musings, I'll call it, throughout the book as they kind of go through their arguments and present some of the available data. That being said, what I found productive was the introduction of many of these cases to the mainstream. So as Sissel intimated earlier, many of the arguments and counter arguments that they've kind of presented in this tome, they've been subject to ongoing healthy debates that have been occurring for several decades among specialists, whether we're talking about specialists who think about big theoretical topics or specialists within a specific cultural region who are doing culture histories of the archaeology in that area. But what does come through, if we were to find the one big thing. For me, at least, as I read this, the key takeaway is that variability. And that variability stems from for better or worse, the creativity of the human brain and cultural capacity. So how we imagine the present and what it looks like, how we imagine what the past may have looked like, and how we imagine that future. This is something that we do now that for sure we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, if not longer. And because of that, one of the central arguments they make, I think, is that because of that sort of plasticity in our thinking, in our thought and behavior, the kinds of societies that could have existed are probably far more diverse than what we give credit for at the moment. So the kinds of classifications that we project into the past, that's a product of our thinking right now. But if we think about it logically, how many languages have become extinct? How many different cultural societies and forms of social organizations that have existed in the past no longer exist today? It doesn't mean that they can't come back in some form, but it just means that we are looking at slices of time. And I think that's one of the things that often gets lost for many of us is that deep compression of time. We're not talking about days or years, and we're not just talking about centuries either. The archaeological record goes back millions of years. And so to say that we know every kind of society that have existed and that we can see a logical pattern with all of that, in some ways that's a kind of arrogant perspective. And one of the things that I think comes through in their argument is perhaps we should question when someone tells you that they know exactly what the story is. Maybe that's not actually the story, or it's not the only story. So for better or worse, their volume puts that on the table, maybe in effective ways, maybe in not so effective ways, but that would be one thing that I would highlight.
I'll just add to what Nam said, which I think was really, really excellent, is that the history of the disciplines of anthropology and archaeology has been one of classifying variability into manageable pieces and ignoring any of the variation within those manageable pieces. And that I've long thought is problematic. And that's one of the things that I think that they really are kind of putting out there as maybe a challenge to us as anthropologists and archaeologists, at least in this part of the book, that we need to really think about where our ideas about the past cultures come from. What are they based on? And it maybe the more interesting stuff to look at, and I've long thought this, is what doesn't fit neatly into the categories that we have made, which are really, they're kind of arbitrary. It's like, why do we sort our silverware into forks, spoons, and knives into separate, little places within our cabinets? Why is it not fork, spoon, knife together? Because you need that table setting, and fork, spoon, knife together. I don't know where it comes from, but that's how we do classify our silverware.
Just to ask one quick question on that, which is just to say, there's clearly when you're doing the kind of work that Graeber Wengrow are doing, therefore, it strikes me, I think that what they're trying to do is at certain points say, with that in mind, if we let go of the sort of like orthodox kind of narratives we have around this, we might look at the evidence. And again, this is where I was like, I'm going to be useless. I don't really know what a debate about evidence looks like in the context of the kind of archaeological work that the two of you are doing, but it would be, we would have interpreted the presence or absence of this as confirming this particular, when you have to come down on one side or the other, you would either dismiss this because it doesn't fit in there, or you would find a way to sort of like come to the conclusion that it fits within the, the existing. And it seems to me as what they're trying to say is, if we let go of that, we might actually come to a different interpretation, or we might look at this a little bit differently, because, what if we were looking for variability and change, and we were thinking about these as sort of politically self-conscious, creative societies that were capable of moving back and forth in different ways. I guess my one question is, particularly in that section of the book, but reading parts of the book, at what bit, what did you go, well, that's going a bit too far, though. I think that's yeah, I'm not really convinced about that. Or, that's a harder sell. Was it sort of consistently that you thought they're always going to lean on this side? Or was it, yeah, I could believe this piece of evidence, that's fairly robust, that's well established in the new archaeological evidence, but there's a couple of places where I couldn't quite go there. How did you respond to that debate about the sort of the robustness of the evidence or their interpretation of it?
So for me, some of the arguments that they were making regarding the agricultural revolution, for instance, I found to be compelling, because we don't see a linear, neat progression. People don't adopt farming as soon as the practices become known, as soon as domesticated plants and animals come into the picture. It does happen from the archaeological record for many places in fits and starts. It's experimentation. And I think the phrase that they use was something like play farming, that it's the hunter-gatherer fisher societies that are innovating, they're experimenting. And not only are they experimenting with the plants and animals and these various species, but there are social organizations that are also being experimented upon as well, as they relate to these landscapes and these resources, the natural terrain around them. So in that sense, I found myself agreeing with their kind of critique of longstanding narratives about human history. Some of the areas where I had a little bit of issue might be, this actually was outside of the 3 or 4 chapters that we were focused on, but from the beginning, where they talked a lot about, they said that there was a carnival parade of political forms. This I agree with in the past, but then they said something about how we've come to be, I think it was, the word they used was trapped in the current predicament that we are currently in. To me, this is a sort of subjective perspective, and it really depends on who you're talking to and how they feel about modern society and where we're going. In some ways, yes, we might be trapped, but in some ways, it almost is reminiscent of the arguments that they are critiquing themselves, because they argue that there had been a conventional tendency that we've gone in this kind of linear progression and reached some endpoint. And if they're arguing that we are now trapped and have no ways of being imaginative to get out of this trap, then in some ways they're making the same argument, that we've reached some kind of endpoint. I remember they cited Francis Fukuyama's book on political order from 2011, but there was a book that was produced even earlier in the 90s, I believe, on the end of history, where he was making a similar kind of analogous argument. I found that to be problematic, and I don't know if others feel the same way, but if you were to ask me to point out different things, that's where I would point to.
I like your big picture criticism, Nam. I got fixated on certain details, like in the last of the chapters. I think it's chapter 7 that we read for today. And at the very end of the chapter, they write, farming, as we can now see, often started out as an economy of deprivation. You only invented it when there was nothing else to be done, which is why it tended to happen first in areas where wild resources were thinnest on the ground. And that is not how agriculture and domestication started in Eastern North America. And I can think that there are probably other parts of the world where that is also not the case. And so there are some places where I think they push the evidence in a direction that they want to highlight in maybe some ways the negativity around the beginnings of agriculture, and all of our efforts to tie that to the beginnings of inequality and I think Katie talked about their sort of pervasive concerns about social inequality that run through as a common element in the book. And so this is a place where I think they may have just manipulated the evidence a little bit in favor of their big overarching theme.
Yes, I mean, I really appreciate that, Cecil, because I thought about, it's kind of when you're reading something and, I thought they can't, there must be times when they're overextending an argument or where they're sort of, leaning in a particular interpretation. I don't know where those places are, but again, in terms of the sort of overall book, in terms of the contribution, in terms of starting rather than ending conversations, I was like, I think there's enough in here to engage with, but I was curious about that. And Nam, your point is really well made and connects with a question that's in the chat that we won't have time for this week, but I know that you're going to be back with us for the fourth and final week. I can't remember if you were able to, Cecil, but I'll bother you about it anyway. And if you can, it would be lovely to have you again as well, thinking about, though, basically, how should this inform our thinking about social inequality in the present moment? And are we really as stuck as the authors argue that we are, having laid out this argument for how creative and politically flexible we were in the past? But for now, I'll just say, thank you, especially to our two guests today, for their comments and for answering questions so thoughtfully. I really appreciate your time. And thanks to everyone else who came. Come back next week, because we've got two other archaeologists with expertise on chapters 9 and 10 in particular of the book, who'll be sharing their thoughts and responding to some of our comments as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks to you, Stephen, and to the Center for organizing this, and for everybody who came and attended. Really, really interesting conversations. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
And I'll be here next week, Stephen.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.